that the Bible's Elohim stories are a retelling of the Sumerian Anunnaki stories.
This is so easy to do. I think anyone can really now, you can buy the Enuma Elish on Amazon, or you can even download it online pretty much for free. And then of course, most people already have a Bible.
We have the original version of the Gospel of Mark, and you can find the original version in the Codex Sinaiticus.
Yeah.
The Gospel of Mark is there, but there's no resurrection narrative.
I saw a lot of killing and murdering in the Bible. I saw a lot of slavery in the Bible. I just saw a lot of unfair things and unfair treatment between the Old Testament and even into the New Testament that to me just didn't make sense. So obviously, the reason why we started this podcast is because we wanted to be able to analyze deeper a lot of the ancient texts, biblical texts, and different texts from even around the world. It could be the Torah, it could be the Quran, it could be many different texts. But you being one of the foremost expert in a lot of this information, as you had been involved in the church for 33 years, I thought you would be the perfect person to do this with me and to eventually really teach me some things as well, because it's a lot of knowledge that you have in your head that I don't have in mine yet.
Well, I'm looking forward to this too, because people know me as the paleo contact guy.
Right.
Paleo contact, in case people don't know, is the theory that in the deep past, our ancestors had contact experiences with other civilizations. But my route into that has been through my studies of the Bible, 33 years in church-based ministry. I was a theological educator, training pastors in hermeneutics, which is the principles of interpreting ancient texts.
Right.
And it was really that work that got me into this field. And I was absolutely sold out on the traditional, mainstream, orthodox view of the Bible. I was an archdeacon in the Anglican Church in Australia. That's one down from a bishop. And so my life was really wedded to a particular way of reading the Bible. But through now, 40 years of preaching from it and 15 years of training pastors to study it, it has forced me to engage with those texts at a deeper level and to see things in the text that actually don't fit with our conventional tellings.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. I'm not an expert in biblical text, and I don't pretend to be. I make, statements or theories or ideas about what I've seen and what I perceive to understand in text and a lot of the religious texts, and comparing it to a lot of the ancient texts. One thing that I found, and you can tell me if I'm on the right or wrong path, is I found that there seems to be a lot of incredible parallels between ancient text and biblical text. I see stories kind of being extremely similar in certain areas where it seems as if, since these ancient texts were a little bit older than the biblical text, it seems as if some of it was somehow copied or rewritten or reinterpreted and put into some of the newer text.
Well, this is something that every pastor learns when they go to seminary or theological college. I did my theology degree at the University of Nottingham, and you were confronted with the fact that the Bible has sources, that the biblical writers have had other sources before them, which they have used in some fashion to shape the familiar stories of, well, we take them as stories of God, but I argue not all of them are. The stories of the Elohim and the stories of Yahweh, some of those are a retelling of Mesopotamian story. Now, Christians didn't know this until the 1800s. And it was only after we found the translation key, the Behistun inscription, that allowed us to read the ancient cuneiforms from out of ancient Sumeria, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria, began recognizing stories that they already knew from the Bible. And so it was Assyriologists like George Smith writing in 1876 and Nathaniel Schmidt writing in 1896, who started pointing out these parallels and the very high probability that the Mesopotamian texts were the sources. And if you get hold of an academic Bible, an extended study edition of the New Jerusalem Bible, for instance, they're very open about this source dependence. So we learn about this at university. We learn about this when we study theology. But then the question comes, well, what does that mean? What's the significance of that? And there are scholars who said, oh, well, clearly the biblical writers were aware of the Anuna of Sumeria, the Anunnaki of Babylonia. They knew these stories. They have summarized them. But a scholar like Michael Heiser would say they've inverted the stories. They know the stories. They've given another version, but they've given a little twist because they're teaching something new. But there are problems with that. And one problem is, are you going to base a true story, something that's going to be claimed as divine revelation, on a false story? What is the logic of that? And I find, and I argue for this in my books, particularly the Eden Conspiracy and Escaping from Eden, that when we find the summary forms in Genesis 1, Genesis 3, Genesis 6, Genesis 11, Deuteronomy 32, Psalm 82, all those would be examples of where the biblical writers have summarized a Mesopotamian story. There's no inversion. There's no twist to it. Only the names of the characters have been changed, and you're given a shorter form. And some of the correlations are very detailed and very close. And the Noah story is probably a great example of that, where the Atrahasis story talks about the releasing of a number of birds to confirm that the flood is receding, and Noah releases one bird. In the story of the flood, across all the cultural tellings of that story in Mesopotamia and into the biblical story, there's only a 4% variance of the volume of that escape vessel given from all the measurements that are in those texts. So the dependence is very, very clear. And the question I ask in my books is, what are the implications of acknowledging that the Bible's Elohim stories are a retelling of the Sumerian Anunnaki stories? And the Eden series really follows the logic of those questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going through the Enuma Elish and really combing through it up and down, inside and out. And then I saw just a lot of similarities between the Enuma Elish and the Genesis story. And I was just like blown away that these correlations or these similarities were so extreme. And if I don't know if you were going to go into that today, but I did have a little bit of a breakdown that I wanted to go over.
Sure. Yes, feel free. The one that struck me on my most recent reading is there are even names that correlate. Asherah in the Bible is Asheri in the Enuma Elish, and they are credited with exactly the same things. So I think you're on the money there, Billy.
Yeah. Even Marduk is, or depending on how you want to pronounce it, Marduk or Marduk, he's in the ancient Sumerian tablets, specifically even in the Enuma Elish, but he's also in the Torah and he's also in the Bible. So we see this name carried over from even much more ancient text that goes back thousands of years, which is pretty interesting.
Yes, it is interesting. And see, all those things were being spotted back in the 1800s. So it's known at an academic level. Pastors come across this information while they're being trained, doing their theological degrees and their higher degrees. But unfortunately, information doesn't filter down into the rank and file of the churches. So when you start speaking about this publicly, it comes as a huge shock to a lot of mainstream Christians, and you get a lot of pushback from it. And very often I say to people who are giving me pushback, well, go and talk to your theological faculty, get into a locked room with your pastor and ask about what he learned at theological college, and you may be surprised at how much of what I'm talking about is known at that level.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, you went through the full process. So if anybody would know, you would know, especially after being involved in the church for 33 years, which is incredible. Just a couple of similarities I wanted to break down that I was able to just find. And this is so easy to do. I think anyone can really now, you can buy the Enuma Elish on Amazon, or you can even download it online pretty much for free. And then of course, most people already have a Bible. So I think they can kind of go through these, but just a few areas that I saw, for example, primordial chaos and the unformed earth. In the Enuma Elish, tablet 1, lines 1 through 5, when on high, the heaven had not been named. Firm ground below had not been called by name. Naught but primordial Apsu, their begetter, Mumu, Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters commingling as a single body. And then if you really analyze that and look into Genesis 1, verses 1 through, chapter 1, verses 1 through 2, it says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. So if you look at the comparisons there, in the Enuma Elish, creation begins with a formless, watery chaos in the Apsu, fresh water, Tiamat, which was salt water, and commingled in the unstructured state. No heaven or earth yet existed by name. And in Genesis, the initial state is similarly undefined. The earth is without form and void, and there is a deep covered in darkness with divine presence hovering over the waters.
Yes.
And so it's credible.
Yes, the parallels are extremely close. So both narratives begin with the need to separate the waters. So fresh water from salt water. Yes. And I argue this is actually a story of rehabilitation. It's not a creation narrative. It's the rehabilitation of a devastated planet. And the Hebrew phrase for chaos is tohu wa bohu, which implies that there was order, but something has happened and now it's in chaos. It's been devastated.
Yeah.
And then the idea that the heavens appear, again, I argue it's not that the heavens are created, it's that the heavens cannot be seen. That There's a pall of dust and ash and soot in the atmosphere which has to be cleared. And this picture of darkness and flooding and chaos that has to be returned to order, waters separated, land separated from water, is not just in these two narratives. You can hear it in the Iroquois story of beginnings. Yeah. You can hear it in the Filipino story of beginnings. You can hear it in the Popol Vuh, the Mayan story of beginnings. And so it always catches my interest when there is sort of external corroboration of details, and especially if they are mind-boggling, unlikely sounding details, but repeating from culture to culture. And it suggests there's this shared bed of cultural memory that's expressing itself through all these traditions. Yeah,
absolutely. You're so right with that. I mean, just the concept of a primordial watery abyss found in both texts, while in Hebrew, we know that Tehom is deep, and linguistically it's derived from Tiamat. So the conceptual resemblance is really striking, that both function as chaotic waters before creation. So it's just, like you said, the story has been repeated all around the world in several indigenous cultures, which is just uncanny. You almost have to say, well, it's not a coincidence anymore.
Exactly. Yes, and that was what first caught my attention. I'd like to go back to an even more basic question and ask how you first encountered the Bible and what your beliefs about the Bible were when you first encountered it and how that shifted. And then I'll share my own journey.
Sure, definitely. That's a great question. So I found the Bible as a young child. When I was very young, my father saw that I had an aptitude for reading. And, fortunately for me, he started making me do a lot of book reports at a very young age. And we didn't have a lot of money for books, so everyone had Bibles laying around. So I started doing book reports on the Bible. And the interesting thing about that is when you're doing a book report, it forces you to read the material, read the information. But then at the end of the book report, you have to do a summary. So you have to now show that you have reading comprehension, right? So over time, I started going through the Bible from the beginning to the end, literally. And I started seeing inconsistencies. Now, my family themselves, they were part religious, part spiritual. They were kind of a little mingling in both, okay, both areas. where they were kind of both spiritual and into biblical texts as well, or into religion, but not overbearingly, which was good for me because it gave me the freedom to explore and not be afraid to ask questions and dig deeper. And as I began to go through the biblical text and, going from the Old Testament and swinging into the New Testament, I just saw a lot of things that just didn't add up. I began to understand that there was references to multiple entities, not just one entity, and that it was being proclaimed by everyone mostly, that there was only one. But I can clearly see from doing these book reports, there was more than one. And I'm scratching my head like, how come nobody can really see this, And so that led me down the path of realizing that there's a lot of great information in the biblical text. There's a lot of stuff that's really good in there that I even apply to my life still to this current day, that give me a positive result, give me a great result in my life, all right? But I also realized that there's also some information in there that for at least me, based on my research and understanding, I can discard that information because some of it I don't think is going to give me a good result. Some of it will promote me to do things that may be dark or evil, or accept darkness or evil. And I didn't want to go down that path. And when I say darkness or evil, I'm talking about I saw a lot of killing and murdering in the Bible. I saw a lot of slavery in the Bible. I just saw a lot of unfair things and unfair treatment between the Old Testament and even into the New Testament that to me just didn't make sense. And so when I became to come to my own understanding that my God, the God that I believe that actually exists, because I believe that there's a God. I've always said I believe that there's a God because I think the mathematics of the universe, the quantum physics and everything else proves that we're living in a creation and everything is created. But I don't believe that my God, with as much power and wisdom and understanding and everything else, would create a people and then, torture them or allow them to be tortured, allow them to be enslaved and things like that. So I just saw it as maybe men. My opinion that I got at an early age was that this seems like men trying to fulfill their own agenda within this text and proclaiming it to be from God so that they can fulfill their agenda. And that's where I ended up. And that really led me down the road of more spirituality and believing that I have a direct connection to God, that I don't need a middleman to get to God.
Yes. Now, what you just said about human agendas behind the writing of different portions of Scripture, that is totally uncontroversial in academic circles. As soon as you're studying source criticism or source analysis, you understand that there's a body of literature here that was written to endorse the monarchy, to endorse the priesthood, that there's a political agenda. The Bible itself talks about a narrative shift to shift Judaism into monotheism. So you're quite right. There are human agendas. I didn't realize this when I first came across the Bible as a young boy. Like you, Billy, my story is somewhat similar to yours, actually, because like you, I began with a love of reading. And I think it was my mum and dad who really instilled that in me. We had a house full of deeply interesting books, and they introduced me to A.A. Milne and the Winnie the Pooh books. And they are written so beautifully that I was just fascinated by the joy of reading and writing. I love to read those stories out loud because they're sort of written that way. And what that meant was when I was in primary school, which I think you call grade school in the USA, this is for little kids, I would often be picked to do readings. But they didn't want me reading Winnie the Pooh. They wanted me to read from the Bible for the school assemblies. And so we dusted off my mum's King James Bible, and I would do readings from that. And that was my introduction. And I found it very fascinating. The language was very evocative. This was about something that was not sort of the everyday world. So I was intrigued by it. And then the next point in the story really was when I joined the school choir by accident when I went to high school. I thought I was joining the orchestra, but I'd ticked the wrong box and I joined the choir. And we started singing medieval church music by people like Thomas Tallis and William Byrd. And what was interesting about them was a lot of their songs were biblical texts set to music. And they were absolutely beautiful. And even as a young boy of 12, 13, 14, and an atheist, I should say, I nevertheless found these texts beautiful. And the idea of this longing after something transcendent, and the idea that the spirit of God, the spirit of the creative force of the universe could somehow indwell us, I thought, if that is true, then that's the most incredible and beautiful thing in the world. And that sort of hooked me. Then I befriended some Christians who challenged me to start reading the Gospels. And so I read the Gospel of Mark and quickly realized that the identity of Jesus was quite an important question for the writers of the Gospels and New Testament. That led me into the world of faith. And having been an atheist, I became a Christian, and I had a powerful spiritual experience when I made a decision to follow Jesus. And what happened to me happens with a lot of people. You have a powerful spiritual experience, and then you say, oh, okay, these guys are obviously on the right track. What do you all believe? Mm-hmm. And so my start point was simply to listen to what they believed about the Bible and think, well, they must be right, because, you know, there are genuine spiritual experiences happening in their church community, except it didn't all add up. And I had questions. Why do we treat the Bible as if it sort of came down in a bubble when clearly there's a story to it? It's evolved. It was written by different people. Why do we approach it that way? Why do we approach this part this way and this part in a totally different way? Why do you seem to take this bit literally and this bit you don't take literally? And the questions I was asking were not getting very good answers. Even a basic one like, so where did the New Testament come from? And I couldn't get my answers. And it wasn't really, it was, I think that was what gave me the urge to go further, to start studying theology, to go to the University of Nottingham. I went to the University of Bath first to study. I did 4 terms of languages and linguistics. That stood me in really good stead to go and do theology, which I did at the University of Nottingham, and also at the Instituto Pastoral Regional de Pernambuco in Brazil. Also studied at the Instituto Machiavelli in Florence. And I went with all these questions that I still needed settling. And of course I found out, of course the Bible evolved. Of course there was a process in which it came to be, an order in which things arrived, moments in history when it was canonized and the canon was changed and all this. Of course the Bible has a story. And as soon as you start studying the history of the Bible, and again, I'm not saying anything controversial, anyone who's a trained theologian knows about this history, it really makes impossible a fundamentalist reading of the Bible. You can no longer regard it as if every word was dictated, you know, by God. You begin seeing it as a document within history with questions that you might want to take to it. And if you're not going to read it fundamentally, in a fundamentalist way, then how do you read it? What are the questions you take to the text? And so at that point, my faith in the Bible didn't diminish. I became more interested in it. But my questions were different. What is the history of this? Where has it come from? What is the information in it? What is the information that is reliable? What's the information that's going to help me if I'm looking to evolve as a person and a spiritual being?
Yeah, incredible. That's an incredible story, man. It is kind of a parallel story to mine, except, of course, you went all the way into the academic aspect of it and followed it through all the way to an incredible, level. I mean, that's just so powerful that this is why when I talk to you, every time I talk to you and we talk about these topics, even others, I always feel like I'm talking to a great teacher. And I'm not just patting you on the back. I really do. I tell Elizabeth this all the time, because your method, your understanding, your knowledge, is so embedded in you, and that you have it, it just flows out naturally. And your academic prowess is so evident, and the work that you put in, man, over the years to get to this level, hats off to you, because it's amazing.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you saying that. My position is really not so different to most pastors in the world who have got a theological degree, who've done that further study. Most pastors find themselves in a position of wanting to develop the thought life of their congregations. So they will probably not read the Bible in a fundamentalist way. They will be aware of questions of contradictions, for instance, between gospels, and it doesn't worry them because they don't read the Bible that way. But their calculation is always, how far can I carry my congregation? Mm-hmm. How much can I share with them before they say, sorry, Pastor, you've departed from the script we're all used to. We prefer the old way of looking at things.
Yeah.
And so though people might think, wow, Paul's way out to the left field of the Orthodox mainstream, if you get a lot of pastors behind closed doors, you'll find, oh, actually, no, he isn't. He's just followed the logic a bit further, and he's being more open about his conclusions. And I'm in contact with pastors all around the world who fully understand my work, understand the credibility behind it, and are asking themselves, how much of this can I share with my congregations before the teaching relationship breaks?
Gotcha.
And it's not an easy calculation, because even though academic theologians have known what we were saying before about the dependency of the Bible on the Mesopotamian corpus, most people in our churches haven't even heard of the Enuma Elish or the myth of Adapa or the Atrahasis tablet or the Epic of Gilgamesh. My books, the Eden series, are really, I'm hoping I can help people run to catch up with all of that, because ultimately it's empowering information. There is important information in the Bible which we miss if we read it all as God's story and disregard that we're getting a reiteration of even older stories.
Absolutely. I agree.
With other points to make.
Yes, absolutely. I agree 100%. And just like there's great information in the biblical text, there's great information, like you just said, in the ancient text, that if you apply to your life, you can actually get a positive and incredible result. And it's just a matter of knowing, what do you keep and what do you discard, right? So it works both ways.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. What else do we have on today's teaching, on today's Bible study? What else do we have? What other information can we bring forward to enlighten people today?
I think for me, one of the interesting questions is how we approach Scripture, what questions we take to it. And certainly I know that in my evangelical days, my questions were all about historicity. What happened? What really happened? What can we prove? Because then we can build our argument for Christianity on that. And so the historicity of Christianity is something that's always discussed if you go on an alpha course or if an evangelist is preaching to you. But one of the challenges of that is we do not have any contemporaneous report. If we're going to the stories of Jesus, we have no contemporaneous report on Jesus other than what is in the Christian documents. So the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the extra canonical Gospels. So how can we confirm that information? We might look for internal consistency. Do they validate each other? And to an extent they do, and to an extent there are some very surprising contradictions. So that internal consistency is a question mark. But then when you look for external corroboration, there's nothing.
Yeah.
We are 1 degree removed from it. We can get back to writers like Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny, Josephus, and they were all writing in the sort of 100s sort of period, and they're talking about the practice and beliefs of the primitive Christians. So we can get back to there. But what we don't have is local reportage from the time. I saw Jesus down the street today, did an amazing rally, some people got healed. There's nothing like that, no Roman records relating to him. And so there's this big question mark over the historicity of Christianity. So that's why there's a bit of debate around that. People often ask me, do I believe in an historical Jesus with the lack of that evidence? And I do personally, because I think it's easy to track how the Roman Empire hijacked and then distorted the Christian story.
Yes.
And I don't think it would have needed to do that if there wasn't an authentic Jesus story prior that was inconvenient to the empire.
Yeah.
So that makes me very confident that there really was a Jesus and an original Jesus tradition. But historicity was not the be-all and end-all to the early Christians. So if you go to someone like Justin Martyr, who was martyred for his faith, his big argument was not our stories are history and yours are rubbish. His argument was, you talk about figures in your stories, you Romans, you Greeks, you talk about resurrection, you talk about ascension, you talk about sons and daughters of Zeus. You need to let us make the same claims for our Jesus. Thank you very much. We're not saying anything new. Yeah. We just want to say about our Jesus what you're saying about your figures. That's very different from the argument for historicity that a lot of apologists are interested in today. Yeah. So I think if you're looking for historicity, then you tend to focus all your interest on the earliest Gospels and the canonical Gospels, the one that cohere with orthodoxy, whereas my interest is a little bit different to that. I like to go even earlier than that, to the very earliest sources. And so a lot of scholars believe the Gospel of Thomas is probably the earliest Gospel. And I think there are form analytical clues in the text that's what you're looking at. It's not finessed. It's not accommodated to other Gospels. It's not accommodated to orthodoxy. It's a primitive document. We have Thomas. We have Q, which is the common written source used by Matthew and Luke. And we have the original version of the Gospel of Mark. And you can find the original version in the Codex Sinaiticus. Yeah. The Gospel of Mark is there, but there's no resurrection narrative.
Correct.
So in Thomas, Q, and Mark, you've got sayings, and in Mark, deeds as well, but no resurrection narrative. And that tells us that there were communities of faith producing literature for whom that was not a central part of the story, which I find very intriguing. So I love going back to the beginnings, looking what primitive Christianity was before the orthodoxization began. But then I'm interested in how it developed as well. So I'm interested in the other Gospels, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, Pistis Sophia, texts like that, because they tell me what other Christian communities were thinking, what their beliefs were about Jesus. And some of these are pretty early. I mean, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the earliest fragment of that is earlier than the earliest fragment we have for the Gospel of Matthew.
That's a fact.
So it's not that they're much later. They're very, very close in time, written in the 200s. And they tell us what Christians believed at that point, what their wisdom teachings were. And if I'm going to those texts, I'm going with different questions. I might be going with wisdom questions as well. If I'm looking for teachings about ascension, how to evolve, how to become more than I am, those texts really major on questions like that. Yeah. And so I think sometimes it's easy to talk at cross purposes because people's interest in the Bible is different. Some want to prove history. Some want to prove orthodoxy. I'm interested in what the early Christians believed and what wisdom they have for me to take away. So I think that it's worth acknowledging that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are different perspectives and different perceptions and even different agendas based on the person that's trying to interpret the text. And so people will look at different versions and claim that, some cases people will claim they always have the right version of the story, or that their telling of it is accurate. But as I'm now talking to you, I'm realizing that there's many different versions and many different interpretations, and even different eras of time where the stories have been written. And
Yes.
you can get sometimes, like you say, a more clearer view when you go deeper into the past, which is why I love studying ancient texts and tablets, because you're going far beyond what anyone else has taken and utilized for a base. And sometimes I think that gets you as closer to the truth as possible.
Yes, I mean, I'm interested in the kaleidoscope of theology that was Christianity in the beginning. I'm very, very familiar with orthodoxy. That was my world for a very, very long time. But I've always been curious to know, well, what did the Christians believe before the canonization of the New Testament? What did they believe in the 200s? What did they believe in the 300s? And for many years, I taught courses in the history of Christian thought. And I think it's helpful for people to know Christianity hasn't always looked like it looks to us today. It too has evolved.